Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Does American foreign policy possess a specific DNA? It would seem so. It doesn't matter who the president is. It doesn't matter which party controls the White House. One can easily ask the following question. Is Trump's time in office serving George W. Bush's third term or Barack Obama's third term? The neocons are firmly in the saddle. Cross-talking American foreign policy, I'm joined by my guest, Hillary Leverett in Washington. She is currently CEO of Stratega, a political risk consultancy, and co-author of the book Going to Tehran. Also in Washington, we have Michael Flanagan. He is president of Flanagan Consulting and a former congressman. And in New York, we cross to Don DeBar. He is an anti-war activist and host of a daily radio program. All right, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Hillary, let me go to you. Off the back of my introduction, I mean, there seems like an enormous amount of continuity in American foreign policy, particularly in this century. I mean, if I didn't know better, I could assume if I didn't know who the president was, based on the campaign, it would be Hillary Clinton in office right now. And that terribly disappoints me, because that was the only reason why I even took an interest in Donald Trump, because he said something different. And now, I guess he's gotten in line. Go ahead, Hillary, in Washington.
Yeah, since the end of the Cold War, there has been a bipartisan consensus for an incredibly interventionist U.S. foreign policy to consolidate the sole superpower nature of U.S. power in the wake of the Cold War. I worked in the Clinton White House, the National Security Council, and at the time I was asked to help write an article in Foreign Affairs magazine called The Rogue Regimes, where the United States was going to go after the rogue regimes, Iran, Iraq, and Cuba. You know, flash forward a few years, there I am in the Bush National Security Council, Bush 43, and there's the axis of evil speech, which is almost word for word what the Clinton doctrine was for Iran, Iraq, and Cuba just a few years before. And then we have Obama in Libya and Syria, and now we have Trump, too, with his attacks in Syria. So there is an enormous amount of continuity for an interventionist U.S. foreign policy to preserve, in their view, to preserve American power and American hegemony around the world, but particularly in the Middle East.
Okay. Michael, let me go to you in Washington. When I hear bipartisan consensus, I get really, really worried, because that means there's no dissent. Don't disagree. Put your head down and just do what you're told. And that's exactly what's happening. And I'd like to add to that is that the mainstream media, the corporate media, they're just stenographers for that same message. Go ahead, Michael.
You're not entirely wrong, but I think this president is a little different. I think if we really had a neocon in office, we'd have 50,000 troops on the ground in Syria, and we'd be looking at a long occupation. I think what you have is a reaction to chemical weapons, at least insofar as they believe it to be true. And I think that's really all you have. There's nobody talking about putting many troops on the ground for an occupation, or hopefully, God
Michael,
save us, a reconstruction later.
But don't you
think that's really a great difference?
Don't you think that's a distinction without a difference? I mean, really, okay?
Not at all. Not at all. The cost and time and energy spent of the Iraq invasion and occupation is not happening in Syria. The cost and time and expense and reconstruction of the Afghan invasion and occupation is not happening in Syria.
Well,
and while Hillary is absolutely correct, we have a bipartisan agreement for interventionism. Absolutely, this is interventionist. There's no question that that is true. It is not the same as the neocons' dream of U.S. world hegemony.
I think there's a. Let me go to Don here, because this is really contentious here. Now, okay, Michael, we have also now Pompeo and Bolton. So maybe you aren't giving the president a chance to get up to speed with the men that followed, that were before him, okay? No, because I'm saying this, Michael, as I'm going to ask Don here. You know, Donald Trump has caved on everything when it comes to foreign policy, virtually, okay? Go ahead, Don. You've been listening.
First, on the point of bipartisanship, this is something I always like to just use as context. The only time you know for certain that American politician is telling the truth is when they call another American politician a crook, because they're almost always right, regardless of party. So when you talk about bipartisan consensus, those are the players that we're talking about that are usually, reaching this consensus. It tells you something about the thing that they're agreeing on, what's really behind it. With Trump and the whole foreign policy, program that's been implemented so far or stumbled through or whatever since he took office. Have to go back to him pronouncing the heresies that haven't been spoken since World War II, really, by any major party candidate or even any national, someone seeking national office in the United States. Challenging the foundational assumptions. NATO perhaps is no longer needed because it was supposed to defend against the Soviet Union, which has been gone for 25 years. Regime change, no good, bad idea. Let's take the money that we're spending on the military and build infrastructure. These are heresies that no one was ever allowed to speak. And because Trump was Trump and was drawing people to television sets during the campaign because he was running, they couldn't turn the cameras off on him like they did on Howard Dean and others that they had, fallen out of favor with the media. So now he comes into office. The context is he committed a series of major crimes, all involving being subservient to a foreign power, the evil one, the one that's been the evil one going back to 1917. So everything that he does that's outside of foreign policy convention is going to be looked at through the prism of, is this Putin pulling his strings? And what's happened is that despite some very bad steps taken, in the opinion of most of the world, and by the way, violating international law on a number of occasions. He has actually stepped the U.S. out of the way in Syria to allow Russia, Iran, and them to deal with ISIS, and some other things have happened like that on the international stage as well.
Okay, Hillary, you wanted to jump in there. So much has already been said on this program. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that Trump, in some ways, has tried to distinguish himself, but in a way, like other presidents, that he is going to pursue American dominance in a smarter, cheaper way. Each of the other presidents before him have tried to do that. He, though, does seem to constantly be trying to come back to his campaign promises to extricate U.S. forces, especially from the Middle East. And I think he's doing that not necessarily because he's a principled person, but because he sees the polls. He sees U.S. public opinion polls here, and he knows that the 2018 November midterm elections are critically important for him. If the Congress here, if the House of Representatives especially turns and is not controlled by Republicans, he would be in danger of impeachment. So he's got to go back to what worked for him in the 2016 campaign. There you have the schizophrenia in a way, because he's trying to appeal to that base to come out in November. But on the other hand, he's had to staff his cabinet with neocons, from Vice President Pence to the new Secretary of State designate Pompeo to his new National Security Council advisor John Bolton. So that's where the schizophrenia comes from. I think it's this attempt to try to get his domestic base out in November. They do not want another war in the Middle East. They do not want U.S. troops and treasures squandered abroad. He has to then deal with the fact that he's staffed his entire the upper echelons of his government with neocons.
Michael, Trump really puts himself into a very tight corner because he's disappointing members of his base, people that were very, very supportive of his foreign policy approach during the campaign. And then you have the foreign policy swamp, the blob, and the media that says, well, you're a wimp because you only hit 3 buildings in a Damascus suburb. I mean, he's stuck between the two of them. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, yeah, I'll tell you I watch the Republican right, the way right, the moral equivalent of the progressives on the left, a lot closer maybe than a lot of people do. And I'll tell you, their furor with bombing Syria is not so much that they blew up a couple of buildings in the Damascus suburbs, but that it's a harbinger of the troops that will come, of the treasure that will be spent, of the lives that will be spilled. It's not going to happen. And as long as it doesn't happen, they're going to be fine, just like they were a few months ago when we bombed Syria.
Michael,
the numbers
they're upset with the entity.
My only reaction to that is, Michael, is that everybody said Trump wouldn't be president. Okay, so never say anything like that. Okay, Hillary, you want to jump in right before?
Well,
okay,
I said Trump would be president.
The numbers would belie that.
I think I'm going to call this one right too.
Okay. Go ahead, Hillary.
Yeah, and with all due respect, I think it's important to actually look at the numbers. There are declared over 2,000 U.S. troops in Syria, which of course pales in comparison to what Bush did in Iraq. But still, there are over 2,000 declared U.S. troops. Now we've had come out just in the past few days, the Washington Post is reporting that there are over 5,000 U.S. contractors there in a military role. You also have a dramatic increase in U.S. troops in Afghanistan. So for all that Trump says he wants to leave, and he wants to declare victory over ISIS, especially in Syria, for all of that attempt that he's trying to put forward to extricate the U.S. from places like Syria and Afghanistan, the reality is that you still have, I wouldn't even call them the neoconservatives, I would call them the traditional foreign policy elite, including General Mattis at the Pentagon, who are pushing and pushing constantly for more troops, more sanctions, more U.S. coercive power, not just in the Middle East, but also vis-a-vis Russia and China.
Okay, Don, let me go to you before we go to the break.
I think you confused...
Let me make sure I get Don in here for equal time. No problem. Don, what Hillary just described as mission creep, okay? Because Trump caved on NATO. He caved on Afghanistan. He won't do anything on Yemen, which is really a shame on the entire foreign policy elite in the West. Very shameful. 40 seconds, Don, before we go to the break. Mission creep. Go ahead.
Well, all of these things are happening in a larger context. You have what's been driving American foreign policy for decades is the idea of hegemony and the actualization of hegemony largely across the world. That period has passed. Perhaps it's an epochal shift even. We're seeing a multipolar world rise. We're seeing it actualized. And so the foreign policy perspectives of everyone really has to either ignore that and try to undo it, which I think is impossible and means World War III, essentially, or accommodate it. I believe inside the elites in the West, and I think that Trump, in a very strong way, represents this, one of these tendencies, that there are some that acknowledge the old model doesn't work. It's okay to be at the table with other people. We come
Don,
with many things of value.
I got to jump in here.
And so that's what I think is going on.
I have to jump in here. We're going to go to a hard break, and after that hard break, we'll continue our discussion on Trump's foreign policy. Stay with our team. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing American foreign policy. Okay, let's go back to Hillary in Washington. Vigilante foreign policy and the great powers. And let's put those two together. France, Britain, and the United States reordering the Middle East again, okay? And acting outside of international law in norms. We had these defense and intelligence postures coming out, and revisionist powers, Russia, Iran, China. No, who's the revisionist right now? Who's destroying the UN Charter, going beyond the United Nations Security Council? I mean, it's truly astounding. Of course, the political elite and their pliant stenography media can't even see, 2 inches from their own face. Okay, the pure hypocrisy. I'll tell you, this is destroying the international order. And being I was trained as a professional historian. Remember the League of Nations, okay, when everyone started ignoring it at everyone's peril. I don't think there's a question there, Hillary, but I think you know what I mean. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, but I think it's a critically important point because you have essentially... You have Britain and France in very weak positions that have apparently, seemingly decided to align themselves firmly with the United States and not be independent powers. So you really have the UK and France aligning with the United States to just reinforce whatever the United States wants to do, which leaves the international community without any real balance, which was the brilliance of having the P5, the permanent 5 members of a Security Council and a Security Council in the UN, to have this balance, a multilateral balance in international affairs. That is slowly but surely being destroyed. Yep. And we see with that real devastation, strategic devastation across the globe as the United States is unable to accommodate itself to the the reality of a multipolar world where other countries have power and they're going to exercise it. The only way for the United States to truly be safe in that environment is to work in a balance of power environment with other countries. But instead, you have people here in Washington, especially, holding on to this idea that really blossomed in the wake of the Cold War in the 1990s, that the United States not only could be, but has to be the sole superpower in order to protect itself. That is really what's so dangerous and what I'm concerned is happening right now.
You know, Michael, I want to stay with Britain, France, and the United States. They worked in conjunction in striking illegally, I would point out, Syria, on a pretext that, oh, I thought we heard this story last year. It repeats again. Remarkable. Nobody likes to point that out. So if you don't think this intervention is going to expand, well, I think the past would say differently. So what do you think, Michael? How much are the British and French going to contribute to this intervention? Are they just going to wave flags on the sidelines? Okay, because that's exactly what they'll do. Everybody in the Middle East wants America to do something in the Middle East for their interests, but it's not even in America's interest in the first place. Go ahead, Michael.
I got 14 premises there, Peter, and I love you, but I'm having trouble keeping my head around all of them. So let me try here. Okay. First, I don't think that we are going to be interventionist, and you've asked me to comment on something I don't believe, so I just don't think it's going to happen. Secondly, very quickly with Hillary and the numbers question before the break, the numbers there are aimed at ISIS, not at toppling the regime in Damascus, as they would be if we were neocons.
Oh, really?
And that simply is just not happening. They're coming and they're going.
Really?
Let me finish. Well, I'm sorry, host, yes, okay. I don't think it's about toppling Assad. I think it's about stopping chemical weapons and defeating, and the troops are there to defeat ISIS. It has nothing to do with Assad, and I think you'd have trouble proving otherwise.
You know, when you look at American intervention, look at all the bombing that the United States and its allies have done during the entire course of this war. What they've done is destroy the infrastructure of the Syrian state. No, they didn't go after ISIS. They didn't go after al-Nusra. No, they didn't. What they try to do is erode the sovereignty of Syria, and then the Russians come in, invited in under international law, and then all of a sudden you see the Islamic State starting to shrink. And of course, Trump, maybe willingly, unwillingly, takes credit for it, okay? There's no reason to believe the good intentions of the United States in Syria when its aims are not clear, and when you have someone like Nikki Haley saying, we got to keep our eye on Iran. For maybe a moment, she was transparent. I'll let you finish your point, Michael. Go ahead.
Thank you, Peter. I try never to interrupt the host because your vision is insightful. But I think in this case, a tiny bit misplaced because you anticipate, you are insightful, but you anticipate something that I don't think is going to come to pass. Okay. I don't think we're going to have 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 troops on the ground in Syria. It's just not going to happen, whatever the numbers state. And I'll go one more, and I'll say that if we could get this Mueller commission over with in the United States, Trump could sit with Putin like he sits with the premier of China and others and reach a thoughtful accord. I mean, Mr. Lavrov, if I'm not mistaken, observed recently that there's a slow-moving, slow-rolling coup d'etat going on in the United States. I think it's a little overstated, but I think he anticipates the two men sitting down. And Trump's foreign policy is very personal. It's his personal involvement. It's not well staffed, if you want to be irked about that. But I think if he has a chance to sit with Putin and do what he has to do, I think you'd see a very different Syria. And I certainly see a very different world complexion. He's making great strides with the Chinese in ways that this nation hasn't done before. I think the North Koreans announced today or yesterday or sometime in the near past that they were going to actually look at finally ending the Korean War. That's an incredible stride forward. And it absolutely had to involve the Chinese and Americans working together.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, Michael, and I'll pass this over to Don. They might end their hostilities. They might actually sign a peace treaty. But, Michael, be prepared for that to happen. The United States must withdraw from the peninsula. See, the other side of the story, well, no, that's how the media works, okay? So we might get peace on Korea in spite of Trump, not because of him. We'll see. We'll see. All right, let me go back to Don here. I mean, we had a number of cases during the Obama administration where we had a ceasefire in Syria. Okay, and then we have these false flag attacks. We have Ash Carter destroy a very hard worked on ceasefire. I see the same thing repeating, and I said in the introduction of my program, it doesn't matter who's president, it doesn't matter what party's in power. We have elements within the deep state. Hillary has already talked about it here. They're not going to let this happen because that would actually be a recognition that hegemony, the moment of hegemony, has come to an end. And that's like telling these neocons there's no God. Go ahead, Don.
Look, we know that, first of all, there have been battles on the ground in Syria between Pentagon-backed jihadis and Langley-backed jihadis. So, there are competing American interests on the ground in Syria. That's the point. And they are merely a manifestation of competing interests in Washington and Langley or whatever that, were more or less bundled together for the period from 1945, perhaps, all the way up until last year. And that's started to come unraveled. I think Trump represents a distinct tendency against the trend that prevailed before. And I think what we're seeing in Korea, for example, is, a manifestation of that. And I think a recognition of it on the part of Pyongyang and Beijing. We have to remember what happened. Japan occupied Korea up as far into the peninsula as it could. The United States conquered Japan, and there's no other word for it, unconditional surrender, and essentially just occupied the military bases that Japan had used to occupy Korea up to that point. Then the United States gets into a war, some say tries to take the rest of the peninsula, whatever. And then you have essentially no peace since 1952. The United States has refused to withdraw from Korea. The United States has refused to sign a peace treaty with North Korea, has refused to allow the Korean Peninsula to reunify. Now, if you look at this moment, Trump is actually in a position to allow that to happen politically. If he came out of Korea talks with a peace treaty that allowed the U.S. to pull its troops out of Korea, he could actually benefit politically. And that's probably the first time that's true since 1952 for an American president.
That's really interesting, but I'm not sure that would be considered a victory for the deep state because, what about all those contracts and all those musicians and all those ships, what a pity that would be. See, peace would really...
exactly.
Peace is an impoverishing idea for the current foreign policy elite. I see you nodding your head. Hillary, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it would be devastating, I think, to the foreign policy elite here in Washington. But strategically, it certainly would be wise if Trump could have some sort of peace or settlement or reconciliation with North Korea that would unify the peninsula and have Korea as Korea, not North and South, but Korea as a state, as a nation, to balance along with Japan and China. That would lead to a much more stable environment in Asia and a much more effective position for the United States in Asia, and I would argue throughout the world. But that is something that the foreign policy elite here would hate because it has to be essentially the United States against somebody to fuel both the military-industrial complex here, but also the foreign policy as they see it is not one of balance. It can't be one where you have a strong China, a strong Korea, a strong Japan. It has to be dominance, all of those countries having their power only because the United States lets them do so. That to me is the strategic problem. And you have that in the Middle East too, where I agree with Mike in some ways that Trump may not want to have what's happening, but it is a slippery slope, not one that's accidental, one that is purposeful by the foreign policy elite to maintain American dominance. They really screwed up in terms of Libya, Syria, Iraq. And the problem for them now is they're facing those countries not being part of the pro-American political and security order in the Middle East. And that is something that is unacceptable. Regardless of what the outcome is, whether it's ISIS or a new ISIS, they can't accept those countries, Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Egypt, Iran. They can't accept those big, important countries as independent powers.
Well, That's absolutely true, and we didn't even have a chance to talk about the influence of Israel and Saudi Arabia on his thinking in terms of the Middle East here. I feel like we just hit the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to talk about. Michael, I really appreciate you coming on the program, even though he's arguing with you. Always add value here. Okay, that's all the time we have. Many thanks to my guests in Washington and in New York, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, Crosstalk rules.